The night was deep, the city streets dimly lit by flickering neon signs, but Vin Diesel had no intention of resting. He sat quietly in the back seat of a black SUV parked across the street from Torque's, his own high-end restaurant. Tonight, however, he wasn't here as the owner. He was here as an observer. For months, he had heard conflicting reports, some praising the restaurant's impeccable service, others whispering about growing dissatisfaction among the staff. Instead of relying on second-hand information, Vin Diesel decided to see for himself. He wasn't the type to let problems fester. If something was wrong, he would fix it. Pulling up the hood of his dark sweatshirt and adjusting his baseball cap low over his face, he stepped out of the car. The cold night air brushed against his skin, but he barely noticed. His sharp eyes scanned the restaurant entrance. The warm glow of chandeliers spilled onto the sidewalk, and through the tall windows, he could see patrons laughing over glasses of wine and elegantly plated dishes. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But appearances could be deceiving. Vin Diesel walked in, his heavy boots making barely a sound against the polished floor. The hostess at the front barely glanced at him before offering a polite but somewhat rehearsed greeting. He nodded in return and gestured that he was just looking around. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't want to attract attention, not yet. As he moved through the restaurant, he observed everything with the keen eye of a director on set. The dining area was immaculate, the ambience inviting. The waiters moved efficiently between tables, their uniforms crisp, their smiles carefully maintained. Yet, beneath the surface, there were cracks. One waiter, a young man with tired eyes, subtly rubbed his wrist as he carried a tray laden with plates. A hostess straightened a decorative vase on a nearby table, her hands trembling slightly before she forced herself to stillness. In the far corner, a chef stepped out of the kitchen for a brief moment, running a hand over his face as if trying to shake off exhaustion before returning to his station. Vin Diesel's jaw tightened. Something was off. He made his way toward the kitchen, careful not to disturb the flow of service. As he approached the back, the energy shifted. The noise level increased, clanging pots, the sharp hiss of a grill, the hurried voices of cooks calling out orders. Yet underneath it all, there was tension. A kind of unease that wasn't present in the front of the house. Then he heard it. A muffled sob. Vin Diesel's steps slowed. His ears sharpened, filtering out the ambient noise to locate the source of the sound. It was faint, barely noticeable amid the chaos of the kitchen, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. His gaze followed the sound to a small storage area near the back. The door was slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening, he saw a young waitress, no older than her early 20s, standing stiffly with her head bowed. In front of her stood a middle-aged man, likely the manager, his face twisted with irritation as he whispered something in a sharp, low voice. Vin Diesel's chest tightened. He had seen enough in his life to recognize intimidation when he saw it. He didn't hesitate. With slow, deliberate steps, he pushed the door open. The sudden creak made both the waitress and the manager jolt in surprise. The girl quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, trying to compose herself, while the manager turned around, his expression shifting from frustration to shock the moment he recognized who was standing before him. Silence fell. Vin Diesel didn't speak right away. He simply looked at the two of them, his gaze heavy, assessing. The manager swallowed hard, his body stiff. The waitress kept her eyes on the floor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Finally, Vin Diesel broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "What's going on here?" The manager opened his mouth but faltered. Beads of sweat formed at his temple. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. Vin Diesel wasn't just any customer. He was the owner. And more than that, he was someone who could see through lies. The waitress shifted uneasily, clearly afraid to speak. But Vin Diesel wasn't about to let this slide. His gaze remained locked on the manager, his tone calm but laced with steel. "I'm waiting for an explanation." The restaurant noise faded into the background. Time seemed to stretch, the air growing heavier with every passing second. Vin Diesel had come here tonight expecting to observe. But now, he knew he would have to do more than that. Something was wrong in his restaurant. And he was going to make sure it was made right. The dim storage room was filled with an uneasy silence. The air was thick with tension, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The waitress stood stiffly, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to make her trembling less noticeable. Her eyes were red and swollen, tears still clinging to her lashes. The manager, standing a few feet away, had his jaw clenched, his body rigid like a cornered animal. Vin Diesel's presence in the room was almost suffocating. He didn't need to raise his voice to command authority. His mere stance, arms crossed, expression unreadable, was enough to send a wave of unease through the manager. After a long pause, Vin spoke, his voice even but carrying a weight that made the words heavy. "I asked you a question. What's going on here?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the waitress before forcing a tight smile. "It's nothing, sir. Just a small misunderstanding." His tone was forced, too rehearsed. Vin caught it immediately. His gaze flickered between the two, noticing the way the waitress flinched at the word misunderstanding. Vin took a slow step forward. "Doesn't look like nothing to me." The waitress kept her head down, her fingers twisting nervously at the hem of her apron. She looked like she wanted to disappear. "I just made a mistake with an order," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Vin's eyes didn't leave her face. "And that's why you're crying?" She hesitated. Her lips parted as if to answer, but then she quickly shut them again. Fear. It was written all over her. Vin turned to the manager, his stare unyielding. "You yelled at her?" The manager scoffed, shaking his head. "I was just correcting her. She needs to learn." Vin let out a slow, measured breath, his jaw tightening. He had seen this type before. Men who mistook fear for respect. Men who thought that raising their voice meant raising their authority. He despised them. By making her cry? Vin's voice was dangerously calm now. The manager hesitated. It's not like that." "Then explain it to me." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The manager's mouth opened and closed, but no excuse came out. Vin turned back to the waitress. "Has this happened before?" Her eyes darted toward the manager, then back to Vin. Her hesitation spoke louder than words. Vin's voice softened just a little. "No one is getting fired for telling the truth." She swallowed hard before finally nodding. "It happens all the time. Not just to me, but to the others, too." Her voice cracked slightly. "If we mess up, she stopped, biting her lip, as if afraid to say too much. Vin exhaled slowly. He already had his answer. His gaze locked onto the manager's, but this time, there was no patience left in his expression. "Get out." The manager blinked. "Yes, sir." Vin didn't move, didn't even raise his voice, but there was no mistaking the finality in his words. "You're done here. I don't run my business like this. Go collect your things." The manager's face turned red with panic. "You can't just fire me like this," he sputtered. Vin arched an eyebrow. "I own this place. I can do whatever I want." The silence was deafening. The manager stood frozen for a second longer, then, realizing there was no way out, stormed past Vin, his steps heavy with anger. He yanked the door open and disappeared down the hallway, muttering under his breath. The moment he was gone, the waitress exhaled shakily, as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. She quickly wiped her face, avoiding Vin's gaze. I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Vin shook his head. "You didn't cause anything. You just told the truth. And that's what matters." She finally looked up at him, her expression shifting from fear to something else, relief. For the first time since he had walked into the storage room, the tension in her shoulders eased. Vin glanced toward the kitchen, where the sound of sizzling pans and muffled conversations continued as if nothing had happened. But things had changed. Tonight, he had seen a problem in his restaurant. And he had just taken the first step in fixing it. Vin Diesel stood still, his eyes narrowing as he observed the scene unfolding in front of him. The storage room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. The waitress, still trembling from her confrontation with the manager, kept glancing nervously toward the kitchen, as if expecting more trouble. Her hands shook slightly, betraying the calm facade she was trying to put up, and Vin could feel the weight of her fear pressing down on the room. He took a deliberate step closer to her, trying to close the distance without making her feel cornered. Despite the dim light in the room, his presence was unmistakable, the sort of presence that made others take notice, even if they didn't want to. The woman's eyes flickered toward him, filled with apprehension, yet there was something else there too, something that looked like desperation, like she wanted to say something but was too afraid of the consequences. Vin understood that kind of fear all too well. It wasn't just about the manager anymore. There was something darker at play here, something systemic that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "You're scared," he said, his words not so much a question as an observation. His tone was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. The waitress flinched, her body stiffening slightly. She hadn't expected him to speak so directly, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was searching for an escape. But then, slowly, she exhaled, her shoulders slumping. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak at first. I don't want to get anyone in trouble," she whispered, her voice trembling as if every word was a weight she wasn't sure she should bear. Vin could hear the tremor in her voice, and something inside him twisted. He could see that this wasn't just about her feeling guilty, this was about the deep, rooted fear of losing everything. The power imbalance in the restaurant was crushing, and it had clearly silenced anyone who dared to speak out against it. "You're not in trouble," Vin said, his voice softening as he tried to reassure her. He moved just a little closer, maintaining a respectful distance, but closing the gap enough to let her know he was here, listening. "But I need you to trust me. This place is mine. I won't let anyone hurt my people, not while I'm in charge." The waitress hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between the door to the kitchen and Vin. Her fingers twitched at her sides, as if she were debating whether to say more or remain silent. The fear was palpable now, weighing heavily on her. "I can't," she began, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "If they find out I told you. If they know it came from me." Her words trailed off, but Vin could hear the unspoken threat behind them. The unspoken truth that speaking out could cost her everything, her job, her reputation, maybe even her livelihood. Vin's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that pushing her too hard wouldn't help. He couldn't afford to pressure her in a way that would make her close off. But he also knew that time was running out. The corruption was deep, and it was only a matter of time before more people got hurt. "I swear," he said, his voice steady and serious. "You're not alone in this. I'll make sure no one touches you, and no one touches anyone else. But I need you to help me. Tell me what's been going on here." The room was heavy with silence, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Vin could see the battle going on inside her, the fight between her fear of retaliation and the desire to put an end to the abuse. Her breath quickened, and Vin could tell she was starting to crack, starting to open up to the possibility of change. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with an urgency that Vin couldn't ignore. "It's not just him," she said, her words spilling out quickly as if she couldn't hold them in any longer. "It's the others too. The supervisors, some of the senior staff, they're all in on it. They control everything here. They control how much we work, how much we're paid, everything. And they punish us if we step out of line, if we complain, if we ask for time off, if we don't do what they say. They make us work overtime without pay, take away tips, give us the worst shifts. And if we fight back too much, if we make too much noise, we're out." Just like that. Vin's stomach clenched as the words hit him. The whole system was rotten to the core. It wasn't just about one manager or one bad decision. It was a culture of fear and exploitation that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. His fists clenched at his sides, the urge to fix this overwhelming him. He had built this restaurant with his own hands, and now it felt like everything he had worked for was being destroyed from within. "Tell me who," he said, his voice now harder, his jaw set. He couldn't wait any longer. The manager's reign had to end, but to do that, he needed to know exactly who was involved. "I need names. I need to know who's been doing this." The waitress froze, her face going pale. Her eyes widened, filled with panic. This was the moment where everything could go wrong. If she named names, if she gave them the list, she was putting herself in danger. The fear of retaliation was enough to freeze anyone in their tracks. But Vin had to push. He needed to get the truth. I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "If they find out, if they know I told you, I'll lose everything. I'll be out of here. No questions, no second chances." Vin paused, his hand gripping the edge of the table as he took a deep breath. He could feel his frustration rising, but he had to keep his cool. If he pushed too hard, she might shut down entirely. He stepped back slightly, giving her the space to breathe, to process. His gaze softened, his tone turning gentle once again, though still firm. "I won't let them hurt you," he said, his words low and unwavering. "I'll make sure you're protected. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to help me fix this. You're not alone in this." The waitress looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. It was clear that she didn't know who to trust, but the desperation in Vin's eyes, the promise of protection, finally pushed her to the edge. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay," she said, barely audible. "I'll tell you. But you have to promise me, you have to protect everyone. If they find out it was me, they'll make sure we're all gone." Vin nodded, his resolve hardening. "I promise. I'll protect you. I'll protect everyone who's been caught in this mess." The waitress finally started to speak, her voice shaking as she named names, listed incidents, and described the toxic culture that had taken hold of the restaurant. Vin listened carefully, every word settling into his mind as a plan began to form. When she finished, he stood silent for a moment, his fists clenched tightly. He had heard enough. This wouldn't stand. No one should have to work in fear. "This ends today," Vin muttered under his breath, his voice a low growl. "I'm taking this place back." His heart pounded with a mixture of anger and resolve. He wasn't just going to fix this place. He was going to tear down the walls that had been built on fear and start fresh. No more corruption. No more control. The people who had been running things like this were about to find out that Vin Diesel didn't just own a restaurant, he owned the fight for what was right. "You'll be safe," he promised her again, his eyes hardening with determination. "I'll make sure they can't hurt you anymore. You just have to hold on a little longer." And with that, he turned, walking toward the door. The battle had just begun, but Vin Diesel wasn't afraid to take it on. Vin Diesel's mind raced as he stood in the hallway, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead making the shadows around him feel heavier. The conversation with the waitress had rattled him more than he cared to admit. She had spoken about the suffocating atmosphere in the restaurant, the exploitation, the backdoor deals, and the manipulation. It wasn't just about low wages, it was a systemic problem, one that reached far deeper than he had imagined. He knew he had to uncover the full truth. Walking slowly through the back of the restaurant, every step felt like it carried the weight of the world. His eyes scanned the hallways, the bustling kitchen, and the break room door that was slightly ajar. Despite the organized chaos of the restaurant, there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a tension that hung over the workers like a dark cloud. They moved quickly but mechanically, their faces worn, their smiles thin and forced. Vin felt it in his gut. There was something wrong here. Something more than just bad management. He couldn't put it off any longer. The time had come to dig deeper. As he walked past the break room, a figure caught his eye, Jason, one of the waiters who had been with the restaurant for several years. Jason wasn't in a rush like usual, and Vin noticed the way he lingered by the door, his posture rigid, almost as if he was waiting for something to happen. Or someone. Vin's instincts told him that this was his chance. Jason was nervous, and that nervousness was a clue. He approached him slowly, his footsteps deliberate, but not too quick. He didn't want to spook him. When Jason saw him, his expression shifted. The nervous flicker in his eyes was unmistakable. His hand subconsciously reached up to rub his neck, a common sign of stress. "Hey, Jason," Vin said, his voice calm but firm. "Got a minute?" Jason's eyes darted briefly down the hallway, as if checking for anyone who might be listening. The tension in his shoulders was palpable. He seemed to be weighing his options, his gaze flicking from side to side. Finally, he nodded, though there was no enthusiasm in his movements. "Yeah, sure," Jason said, his voice tight, betraying the anxiety he was clearly trying to suppress. "What's up?" Vin didn't waste any time. The moment for pleasantries had passed. He needed answers. "I know something's going on here," Vin began, his voice low but direct. "Something that's not right. I've been watching, and I've been hearing things. You know what I mean. The system here isn't fair. There's more to this place than meets the eye." Jason swallowed hard. Vin could see the way his Adam's apple bobbed, the subtle signs of fear that he was trying to hide. The walls were closing in on him, and it was clear that Jason was fighting an internal battle. He hesitated, then shifted his weight, as if trying to decide whether or not to open up. Finally, Jason spoke in a near whisper. "You don't get it, man," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not just bad pay, it's everything. They make us work doubles, long hours, and when we try to speak up, they just shut us down. They control everything. Tips, shifts, they take whatever they want, and if you try to stand up for yourself, they blacklist you. No one talks about it, but it's happening. All of it." Vin's pulse quickened, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. He felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure. This wasn't the time to show frustration, it was time to get the truth, no matter how grim it was. Jason took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what he was about to reveal. "They say they'll make sure you're taken care of if you stay quiet, but it's a lie. If you don't go along with their plans, you're done. No one gets hired anywhere else, no one gets out. You're stuck here forever." Vin's stomach churned as the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't just a few rogue managers trying to cut corners, it was a full-fledged operation that exploited workers, crushed their spirits, and left them with no way out. The power dynamics at play were far more sinister than he had imagined. But what struck him the most was the fear in Jason's eyes, the sheer terror of speaking out, the crushing weight of knowing that there was no easy escape from this cycle. For a moment, there was silence between them. Jason's eyes darted around nervously, as if he feared someone might be listening from the other side of the door. Vin could almost feel the weight of the entire situation pressing in on him, but he knew he had to stay calm. Jason wasn't the only one suffering in silence, others were too, and if he didn't act now, they'd all remain trapped in this nightmare. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Vin said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, trying to offer a sense of solidarity. "You're not alone. I won't let them get away with this. I'm going to help you. But you have to trust me. You have to help me take them down." Jason's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment, it seemed like he might pull back. The fear was still there, evident in the way his hands trembled, the way his lips tightened. But slowly, something shifted in his gaze. A glimmer of hope, or perhaps just a resignation to the fact that the truth could no longer be buried, began to take root. Jason nodded, though his expression was hesitant. "I don't know how this is going to work," he muttered, his voice low, "but I'll do it. I'll help you. I just want this to stop." Vin placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, squeezing it lightly. "We'll do this together," he said. "But we need to be smart about it. This is going to take time, and we need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Jason's lips twitched into a weak smile, and for the first time in what seemed like a long while, Vin saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. They were on the same side now, and that made all the difference. As Vin walked away, a sense of resolve settled over him. The task ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just fighting for himself or Jason, he was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been taken advantage of by a broken system. He wasn't going to stop until they got justice. And this time, he wasn't going to let fear keep him or anyone else from standing up for what was right. Vin Diesel stood outside Calloway's office, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, but the fire burning inside him was impossible to extinguish. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. He had seen injustice before, played the role of a hero countless times on screen, but this was no Hollywood script. This was real. Real people were suffering, and he couldn't just walk away. As he reached for the doorknob, he hesitated for the briefest moment. Not because he doubted himself, but because he knew that once he stepped inside, there would be no turning back. This confrontation could go in many directions, and he had to be ready for all of them. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The office was grand, almost excessive in its luxury. Dark mahogany furniture gleamed under the soft glow of a chandelier. A large, leather-bound chair sat behind an expensive desk, and in it, Calloway lounged with an air of entitlement. A cigar smoldered in his hand, its tendrils of smoke curling toward the ceiling. His lips curled into a smirk as he saw Vin step in, as if he had been expecting him. "Vin Diesel," Calloway drawled, leaning back comfortably. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Surely, you're not here to complain about the food?" Vin didn't sit. He didn't smile. Instead, he walked forward, each step measured, each movement controlled. He planted both hands firmly on Calloway's desk, leaning in just enough to make it clear that this wasn't a casual visit. His voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of an impending storm. "I know what you've been doing," Vin said, his eyes locked onto Calloway's with unyielding intensity. Calloway raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Oh? And what exactly do you think I've been doing?" Vin clenched his jaw. "Exploiting your employees. Forcing them into unpaid overtime. Cutting wages. Threatening them into silence. Creating a culture of fear where no one dares to speak up. Should I go on?" Calloway exhaled a cloud of smoke and chuckled, shaking his head. Diesel. You really think you can just walk in here and lecture me about business? This is how the real world works. You think you're some kind of hero, but you don't understand the first thing about running a company." Vin's fingers dug into the desk. His voice was sharper now. "The real world doesn't give you the right to treat people like this. These workers, these human beings, you've crushed them under your greed. Some of them have families to feed, medical bills to pay. And you sit here, drinking expensive wine, acting like their suffering doesn't matter." Calloway's smirk faltered, but he masked it quickly. He set his cigar down, his expression turning colder. "And what do you plan to do about it? Tell the media? Sue me? You have no proof." Vin's lips curled into a grim smile. "That's where you're wrong." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. A voice filled the office, a woman's voice, trembling with suppressed emotion. "He forces us into extra shifts without pay. If we refuse, he finds ways to punish us. I can't afford to lose this job, but I can't take it anymore either. Someone has to stop him." Another voice followed, a young man this time. "I tried to stand up to him once. My paycheck suddenly went missing that month. When I asked HR, they said it was a clerical error, but I know it wasn't. He wanted to teach me a lesson." Vin watched as Calloway's face darkened. His jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists. For the first time since Vin had entered the room, the restaurant owner looked unsettled. "You son of a," Calloway started, but Vin cut him off. "You think this is all I have?" Vin's voice was like steel. "I have more. Interviews, messages, testimonies. I could ruin you in a matter of hours." Calloway shot up from his chair, slamming his hands on the desk. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into, Diesel. You're stepping into a world you don't belong in." Vin straightened up, staring Calloway down without an ounce of fear. "No. You don't understand. I'm not here to belong. I'm here to put an end to this." Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Calloway's breathing was heavy, his composure slipping. He had spent years controlling people, silencing them with threats and manipulation. But now, he was the one cornered. Vin took a step back, slipping his phone into his pocket. "You have two choices. Do the right thing, pay your employees what they're owed, fix what you've broken, or watch your empire crumble when the truth comes out." Calloway clenched his teeth, his face a mixture of anger and realization. He knew he had lost. Vin turned and headed for the door. As he reached for the handle, he paused, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't just business, Calloway. It's people's lives. And you don't get to ruin them anymore." With that, he walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. The fight wasn't over yet, but Calloway would soon learn that some battles couldn't be won with power and money alone. Vin Diesel stepped out of Calloway's office, the tension still lingering in his every breath. The confrontation had been intense, but he knew that mere words wouldn't be enough to bring down someone like Calloway. The man was too accustomed to manipulating everything to his advantage. If Vin didn't act immediately, Calloway would find a way to cover his tracks and continue abusing his power. Clenching his fists, Vin's eyes glowed with determination. He pulled out his phone and dialed a trusted contact. His voice was steady but carried an undeniable authority. "It's time. Release everything." Within minutes, social media exploded. Audio recordings of employees being bullied, trembling voices recounting threats and exploitation, every word dripped with fear and helplessness. The posts spread like wildfire. News outlets quickly picked up the story, turning Calloway from a powerful businessman into the center of public outrage. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. The employees, who had long endured in silence, now murmured among themselves. Their phones buzzed with non-stop notifications. Some couldn't believe what they were reading, while others silently shed tears of relief. Rachel, a young waitress, stood in a corner of the kitchen, her hands trembling as she held her phone. She kept reading the same headline over and over. CEO Calloway accused of employee abuse, victims speak out. Tears welled up in her eyes. Looking around, she saw the same emotions mirrored in her colleagues' faces, hope, something they had lost a long time ago. But while the employees began to regain their spirit, Calloway was far from composed. He stormed out of his office, his face flushed red with rage. His eyes darted around, searching for someone to blame. Spotting an employee reading the news on their phone, he lunged forward, snatching it from their hands, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Who's behind this?" The employee flinched but, for the first time, they didn't lower their head in fear. Their voice shook, but there was resolve in it. "Everyone knows the truth now, Calloway. You can't hide anymore." Calloway's fury escalated, but before he could react, the restaurant doors swung open. A wave of reporters, lawyers, and labor inspectors rushed in. They carried documents, evidence, undeniable proof of Calloway's misconduct. And standing right behind them, like an immovable force, was Vin Diesel. He didn't say a word. He just stared at Calloway, his gaze cold yet commanding. Calloway took an involuntary step back, his usual confidence now wavering. "You think you can take me down that easily?" He tried to sound threatening. "I have lawyers. I have power. I have. And I have the truth." Vin cut him off, his voice firm, delivering a verbal punch straight to Calloway's ego. One of the labor inspectors raised a thick folder. "We have multiple testimonies from employees, evidence of withheld wages, and severe violations of labor laws. Effective immediately, this establishment will be under investigation." Calloway's mouth hung open, unable to form a response. He looked around, searching for an escape, but every exit was blocked. Vin took a step forward, lowering his voice just enough for Calloway to hear. "You built your empire on fear and greed. But fear doesn't last forever. Once people find their courage, you have no power left." Calloway staggered, his face draining of color. The police officers accompanying the inspectors stepped forward, ready to take him into custody. The restaurant fell silent as employees held their breath. Then, as Calloway was handcuffed and led away, the silence broke into applause. At first, it was scattered, hesitant. But soon, the entire staff joined in, clapping, cheering, celebrating their newfound freedom. Vin watched quietly, a small, satisfied smile appearing on his face. This wasn't just about a restaurant breaking free from a tyrant. It was about people who had been oppressed for too long finally reclaiming their voices. They were no longer passive victims. They had risen, fought, and won. A staff member approached Vin, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, we would have never dared to stand up to him." Vin shook his head, offering a warm smile. "No need to thank me," he said. "You had the strength all along. I just helped you see it." With that, Vin walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a place no longer ruled by fear, but by freedom. The cold clink of handcuffs echoed through the air as they tightened around Calloway's wrists, a harsh sound that seemed to slam shut like a steel door, trapping him in an undeniable truth. The man who had once ruled the restaurant, who had threatened and manipulated his staff, now stood there with a twisted face, filled with both fear and rage. He struggled, his bloodshot eyes glaring with indignation. "This is a mistake. You have no right to do this to me. I have a lawyer. I'll sue all of you." But no one paid any attention to his threats anymore. Once the truth had been revealed, the power he once held had vanished. The people who had once bowed to him now stood tall, their eyes bright with newfound hope. Vin Diesel looked at Calloway, his gaze calm but full of authority. He didn't need to raise his voice, nor did he need to threaten. A single look was enough to make Calloway realize that his time was over. "You had the chance to change," Vin said, his voice steady but cold. "But you chose greed, chose to trample on others to climb up. Now, you'll pay the price." The labor inspector stepped forward, holding a thick stack of files, all the evidence of Calloway's exploitation, wage theft, and abuse of staff. "Mr. Calloway," the inspector declared clearly, each word like a nail being driven into a coffin, "you will face a full investigation for labor violations, abuse of power, and other criminal actions. Witnesses, documents, recordings, everything is against you. You can have your lawyer, but the law doesn't stand with the oppressor." The restaurant staff, those who had quietly endured, those who once thought no one would stand by them, now stood in a line, watching as the man who had tormented them was taken away. Some were tearful, not out of fear, but because of the relief they felt. Rachel, the young waitress who had once cried under Calloway's pressure, whispered softly to herself, "It's finally over." Calloway continued to thrash, trying to escape the police circle, but the restaurant's door swung open, revealing an even more terrifying scene than the handcuffs around his wrists, a sea of reporters with cameras, microphones, and flashing lights. "Mr. Calloway, do you have anything to say about the allegations? Do you deny the charges against you? Employees accuse you of exploitation and abuse. How do you explain that?" Calloway froze. He had once believed he could turn the tables, but now the truth was no longer hidden within the four walls of the restaurant. It had been exposed to the world. He tried to avert his face from the cameras, but it was too late. The image of a tyrant's downfall had been captured forever. Vin Diesel didn't need to say anything more. He simply stood there, watching as the man who had once abused his power now stood as nothing more than a pitiful sight. The police pushed Calloway into the car, slamming the door behind him, marking the end of his reign of cruelty. Inside the restaurant, a moment of silence hung in the air, and then gradually, the atmosphere began to shift. One person clapped, then two, then three, until the entire restaurant erupted in applause. Some hugged each other, while others simply stood there, trying to accept the fact that they had truly been freed. Rachel walked up to Vin, her voice still trembling with emotion. "What happens now?" Vin looked at her, his expression softening. "Now, you start over. No more fear, no more injustice. This restaurant will no longer be a place of orders and oppression, it will be a place of fairness and respect." The manager, who had secretly helped Vin expose Calloway, nodded firmly. "We'll make sure of that." Vin smiled faintly, a rare but sincere smile. He looked around, seeing faces full of hope. With a meaningful nod, Vin Diesel turned and walked away. "Vin!" Rachel called out, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." Vin paused for a moment, turning to look at her. "No need to thank me," he said. "You've always had the power to fight back. You just needed a chance to use it." And then, like a powerful but quiet gust of wind, Vin Diesel disappeared into the night. Behind him, the restaurant remained, no longer a place of fear and injustice, but a symbol of hope, courage, and the rebirth of fairness. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. It felt like the weight of 1,000 burdens had been lifted, but the air was still thick with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. For so long, the employees had been crushed under the oppressive rule of Calloway. They had endured unthinkable treatment, intimidation, harsh work conditions, and constant fear. Each day had been a fight for survival, a fight they had grown used to, despite the toll it had taken on their spirits. But now, with Calloway gone, there was something unfamiliar in the air: freedom. Vin Diesel stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the restaurant's employees. Some were still sitting, unsure of what to do with themselves, while others stood, their posture straighter than before. It was as if they were waiting for someone to tell them what came next, what their new reality would look like. The fear they had lived with for so long still lingered in their expressions, but there was a spark of something else, something that had been buried deep inside them for years: hope. "You're free now," Vin said, his voice low but resolute. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that none of them had felt in so long. The truth of his statement began to settle in, and the room grew still. No one has the right to treat you the way Calloway did. No one has the right to crush your spirit. From now on, this place will stand for respect, respect for you, your time, and your worth. For a moment, there was only silence. The employees exchanged glances, uncertain, as if they were afraid to believe it. Could it really be over? Had the nightmare truly ended? The last years of hardship had blurred together in their minds, and the idea of a different life felt almost too good to be true. Lily, a young woman who had worked at the restaurant for years, stepped forward slowly. She had always been quiet, always kept to herself, but now, her voice was steady, though there was a tremble of emotion just beneath the surface. "What do we do now?" she asked, her eyes searching Vin's face for answers. "We've been living in fear for so long. I don't even know what freedom looks like." Vin looked at her, his expression softening. He could see the pain in her eyes, the deep-rooted exhaustion that had accumulated over the years. Her question wasn't just about what to do next, it was about how to move forward after everything they had endured. "You take it one step at a time," Vin replied, his voice calm but firm. "You rebuild. You begin to trust yourselves again. You show up every day as your true selves, not the versions that were forced to hide. You take pride in your work and in who you are. And most importantly, you stand together. You're stronger than you realize." Lily nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The idea of rebuilding, of reclaiming her identity, was daunting, but it also felt empowering. She could almost see it, working side by side with her coworkers, not as slaves to a tyrant, but as equals, respected for what they brought to the table. The restaurant manager, who had been quietly gathering evidence against Calloway in the background, stood up next. His hands trembled as he wiped them on his apron, clearing his throat. There was a sense of relief in his eyes, but also a deep sadness. The years he had spent witnessing the abuse had weighed heavily on him. "We've all been through hell," he said, his voice shaky but filled with a quiet determination. "But no more. We're not going to let fear rule us anymore. We're going to make this place different. We're going to make it a real team. No more secrets, no more lies, no more fear. From now on, we stand by each other. We look out for one another." His words broke the tension in the room, and one by one, the employees began to nod in agreement. It wasn't just about putting an end to Calloway's reign of terror. It was about creating something new, something they could be proud of. It was about standing up for each other, supporting each other, and building a place where they could finally thrive. Rachel, a young waitress who had always kept to herself, smiled for the first time in a long while. Her shoulders seemed less tense, her expression lighter. She stepped forward, her voice small but filled with quiet resolve. "We're going to make it," she said. "We're going to build something good here. Together." Vin looked at her, a proud smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He knew she was right. They all were. There was no going back to the way things were. The restaurant wasn't just a place to work anymore. It was a symbol of what they could achieve together, what they could rebuild if they stood united. "You all have the power to decide what comes next," Vin said, his voice growing stronger. "This is your chance. Don't waste it. Be bold. Be brave. And most of all, be kind to each other. Treat each other with the respect you deserve, and this place will thrive." As the room filled with murmurs of agreement, Vin knew his work was done. Calloway had been removed, but the real change came from the employees themselves. They now had the opportunity to take control of their own destinies. They could rebuild the restaurant from the ground up, not just as a business, but as a community. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual hustle, but inside the restaurant, a quiet revolution had taken place. The employees no longer felt like victims. They felt like survivors, and, most importantly, like people who had the power to reshape their future. Vin Diesel walked toward the door, glancing back at the group. There was no need for words now. The transformation had begun. As he stepped out into the world, he knew they would be fine. They would find their footing, and they would make something beautiful from the ashes of the past. They had been freed, not just from Calloway, but from the fear that had held them hostage for so long. The doors of the restaurant swung open, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of possibility in the air. The future was theirs to shape, and they weren't going to let anyone take that away from them ever again. The days following the confrontation with Calloway had been filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. While the oppressive weight of his presence had been lifted from the restaurant, Vin Diesel knew that this victory was only the beginning. It wasn't enough to remove the problem and walk away. The real challenge lay in the aftermath, the work of preserving the newfound freedom, protecting the dignity of the employees, and ensuring that no one else would try to seize the power that Calloway had once wielded. Vin spent hours reflecting on the road ahead, contemplating how they could solidify this change. He understood deeply that the system of control that had dominated the restaurant for so long didn't simply disappear with Calloway's dismissal. There were still whispers of fear among the employees, remnants of the trauma they had endured. The restaurant itself had been built on a foundation of fear and exploitation, and that could not be undone overnight. He found himself pacing the empty back hallway late one evening, his thoughts swirling. The success of their rebellion had been a collective effort, but now it was time to lay the groundwork for the future. He couldn't let this victory slip away, not when the threat of another tyrant emerging loomed large. What had been achieved had to be protected, and that meant setting a new course, one that would involve every single employee. One afternoon, he called a mandatory meeting for everyone in the restaurant. The tension in the room was palpable, with employees exchanging nervous glances. The mood was cautiously optimistic but laced with uncertainty. They had tasted freedom, but they weren't sure if they could hold on to it. Vin stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding but also warm. He had proven himself a leader they could trust. As he looked at the faces before him, a quiet determination settled over him. The time for action had come. "We've made it this far, but this isn't the end," Vin began, his voice low but firm. "What we've done here, what we've fought for, is worth protecting. But that protection doesn't come easily. It's not just about getting rid of Calloway, it's about building something better. Something that will last." The room remained silent, each person absorbing the weight of his words. It wasn't just about keeping their jobs, it was about ensuring that they would never again be treated as less than human. That their voices would never again be silenced in favor of fear. Vin could see the anxiety in their eyes, the same anxiety that had plagued him in the days leading up to the confrontation with Calloway. They had suffered too long, and the scars were still fresh. A hand went up. Rachel, the young waitress who had always been outspoken, was the first to speak. Her voice was hesitant, but there was something resolute behind it. "How do we stop this from happening again? What if someone else tries to take control the way Calloway did? How do we protect ourselves?" Vin paused, allowing the question to sink in. He knew she was asking more than just a logistical question. It was a plea for reassurance, a desperate need for certainty in a world that had so often failed them. It was the same question he had been asking himself. "We fight back with unity," Vin answered after a long silence. "We've already learned that together, we're unstoppable. If anyone tries to come in and take advantage of us again, we fight back. Not just for ourselves, but for each other. We hold each other accountable. We stand together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Vin knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to show them how to act on this principle. They had to understand the importance of collective power, the strength that came from standing side by side and demanding respect, not just for themselves, but for the people around them. Lily, the young woman who had stepped up in the earlier confrontation with Calloway, stood up. There was a fire in her eyes now, something new that hadn't been there before. "How do we make sure no one can get away with abusing power again?" she asked, her voice no longer shy or uncertain. "How do we create a system that protects us, even when we're not looking?" Vin smiled, his heart swelling with pride at the transformation he was witnessing. This wasn't just about making them feel safe, it was about empowering them to take control of their own futures. "We create our own system," he said. "A system of transparency. A system where everyone knows their rights, and they have the courage to stand up for them. A system where leadership is not about control, but about responsibility. If anyone abuses their position, we call it out. We do not tolerate injustice." The employees nodded, slowly at first, and then with growing confidence. They were beginning to see the vision he had for them, not as helpless victims, but as active participants in shaping their environment. They were the ones who would decide what kind of culture would thrive in the restaurant moving forward. "Remember, power doesn't belong to a few. It belongs to all of us," Vin continued, his voice steady and strong. "And as long as we are united, no one will be able to tear us apart. We protect each other. We fight for each other. And we hold the line, no matter what." The room fell silent once more, but this time, the silence was charged with purpose. They had heard Vin's words, and they understood what was at stake. The fight for justice wasn't over, it had only just begun. As the meeting came to a close, the employees left with a sense of newfound determination. The fear that had once gripped them was starting to loosen its hold, replaced by something more powerful, a shared commitment to never allow the cycle of abuse to take hold again. They understood now that defending justice wasn't just about standing up to one person, one bully. It was about creating a culture where fairness and respect were non-negotiable. Vin watched as the last of the employees filed out, a quiet smile on his face. There was still a long road ahead, but he knew they were ready. They weren't just fighting for their own rights anymore, they were fighting for the future of everyone who would walk through those doors. And that, Vin realized, was a fight worth having. Justice wasn't something that could be handed to them. It was something they would have to claim for themselves, together, as one. And Vin would be there, every step of the way, guarding that promise.